Anna Parker, a humble waitress at Milliey's diner, quietly leaves food for a mysterious boy, Alex, who lingers in the shadows. Her small act of kindness draws scorn from a cruel customer, but Anna remains steadfast. A cryptic note from Alex, hinting at a connection to his late father, deepens the mystery. When 6 black SUVs arrive, led by a 4-star general, the diner freezes. Who is this boy, and why does a high-ranking officer seek Anna? What secret ties her simple gesture to a military legacy? Stay tuned as hidden truths unravel, revealing the power of compassion. Inspired by Anna's story? Join our community, share your own stories, and support a channel celebrating unsung heroes. Hit that subscribe button. Now, let's spread the power of good deeds together. In the quiet hum of Milliey's diner, a modest haven tucked near an aging military base in rural Texas, Anna Parker moved through her night shift with the grace of someone who had long ago made peace with routine. At 29, Anna carried a quiet resilience, her life shaped by loss and small, stubborn acts of care. 5 years had passed since her mother's death from cancer, a loss that left her unmoored, living alone in a 1-bedroom apartment above the town's only laundromat. The hum of washing machines below was her lullaby, a constant reminder of the world moving on without her. Her closest companion was Milo, a rotund stray cat who had wandered into her life and stayed, his purring presence a balm for the solitude that clung to her like dust. Anna's tip money, earned from long hours on her feet, went to Milo's food and the occasional vet visit, a small rebellion against the emptiness of her days. She'd smile softly when Milo curled up beside her, his warmth a quiet anchor in a life that often felt adrift. The diner itself was a relic, its fluorescent lights flickering like a heartbeat, casting a soft glow over worn leather booths and chipped formica countertops. It was the kind of place where time seemed to pause, drawing locals back year after year for coffee, pie, and the comfort of familiarity. Anna's evenings followed a predictable rhythm, the dinner rush from 5 to 8, a whirlwind of plates and orders, clean up until 9 when the chaos settled, and then the quiet hours when truckers and night owls drifted in, their stories as familiar as the creak of the diner's door. But every night, without fanfare, Anna performed a ritual that went largely unnoticed. She'd gather leftover food, a sandwich, some fries, maybe a slice of pie, and pack it into a small styrofoam container, which she left near the wooden bench at the edge of the parking lot. It was a quiet act of kindness, done with the same efficiency as refilling salt shakers or wiping down sticky menus. She never spoke of it, and most patrons never noticed, their eyes fixed on their meals or their conversations. That Thursday evening in October, however, something shifted. As Anna stepped outside to place the container on the bench, she spotted a boy, no older than 10, standing in the shadows. His clothes hung loosely on his thin frame, the cuffs of his oversized jacket brushing his knuckles. Dirt smudged his cheeks, but his eyes were clear, wide, and solemn, holding a weight that made Anna's heart ache. She saw something in him. Hunger, yes, but also a quiet dignity that reminded her of her mother's lessons about seeing the good in people, even those the world overlooked. Instead of leaving the food and walking away, she approached him, crouching slightly to meet his gaze. Her hands, steady from years of carrying trays, extended the container, and she offered a small, encouraging smile. The boy hesitated, his fingers twitching as if unsure whether to trust the gesture, then took it, his expression unreadable, but his hand steady. Anna's chest tightened, a mix of compassion and curiosity swirling within her. Who was this boy, and what had brought him here, alone in the dusk? Inside the diner, a man in an expensive suit, his BMW being serviced down the street, watched the exchange from his window seat. His lips curled into a sneer, and his voice cut through the hum of conversation like a blade. "Why's she wasting leftovers on that filthy kid?" he said loudly, his words dripping with disdain. The diner fell quiet, the clink of silverware pausing as heads turned. A few patrons chuckled nervously, their laughter fading into awkward silence as they sensed the cruelty in his tone. Others stared at their plates, suddenly engrossed in their meatloaf or mashed potatoes, unwilling to engage. An elderly couple in the corner booth exchanged a glance, their disapproval clear in the tightening of their lips. their hands gripping their coffee mugs a little tighter. They'd known Anna for years, had seen her quiet kindness, and the man's words felt like an affront to the diner's unspoken code of decency. Anna heard every word as she stepped back inside, the cool night air still clinging to her skin. Her cheeks flushed, a faint heat rising under her calm exterior, but her face betrayed nothing. She moved past the man's table, her steps measured, and paused only to rest a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder as he stood clutching the container outside. It was a fleeting gesture, a silent reassurance that she saw him, that he mattered. Her heart raced, not with anger, but with a quiet defiance. She wouldn't let this man's words undo her. She returned to her work, refilling coffee, clearing plates, her smile as steady as ever. But inside, her thoughts churned. She thought of her mother, who had taught her to see the humanity in everyone, even those the world dismissed. She thought of Milo, who had been just another stray until she'd chosen to care. And she thought of the boy, his solemn eyes haunting her, a puzzle she couldn't yet solve. Behind the counter, Frank Perkins, the diner's owner and manager for 37 years, polished glasses with a rag that had seen better days. His weathered hands moved with practiced ease, but his eyes were sharp, taking in the scene. He'd watched Anna's ritual for months, never commenting, only nodding when their gazes met. He admired her quiet strength, the way she carried her losses without letting them define her. Tonight, though, his expression held a question as Anna passed by, his brows lifting slightly. She shook her head almost imperceptibly, a signal that she didn't need him to step in. Frank's lips pressed into a thin line, but he nodded back, trusting her judgment. He moved toward the man's table, coffee pot in hand, his voice deceptively warm. "Refill, sir?" he asked, though the usual Texas hospitality was edged with something cooler, something unyielding, like a warning wrapped in politeness. The man, oblivious to the shift in the room, leaned back in his seat, his suit jacket creasing slightly. "Sure," he said, then added with a smirk, "Tell your waitress she might want to save her charity for someone who matters. Kids like that are just a drain on everyone." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp, like a stain spreading across the diner's warm familiarity. A few patrons shifted uncomfortably, their forks pausing mid-bite, their eyes flicking toward Anna, then away. Frank poured the coffee slowly, deliberately, letting the silence stretch. His hands, calloused from decades of work, were steady, but his heart thumped with a quiet anger. He'd seen too many people pass through this diner, soldiers, drifters, families, loners, to let someone like this man dictate who deserved kindness. When he spoke, his voice was low, steady, and carried the weight of a man who had seen enough of the world to know what mattered. "Everyone matters in my diner, sir," he said. "And I don't tell my staff who deserves kindness. That's not how we do things here." The man scoffed, but the weight of the room's attention pressed down on him. He glanced around, suddenly aware of the eyes on him, the quiet judgment in the air. Conversations resumed, quieter now, and Anna moved through her tasks as if nothing had happened. Her smile didn't falter, but inside her thoughts were a storm. She wondered about the boy, where he went when he left the parking lot, what his life was like beyond those solemn eyes. She wondered if anyone else saw him the way she did, not as a problem, but as a person. And she wondered, with a pang of guilt, if she could do more. The next day, the street outside Milliey's diner came to a standstill. 6 dust-covered black SUVs rolled up, their engines rumbling like a distant storm. Heads turned, conversations hushed, and even the regulars paused, their coffee cups frozen halfway to their lips. The sight was jarring, out of place in the sleepy town where the biggest excitement was usually a Friday night football game. Who was the boy Anna had fed? And why would a general send an entire team to thank a waitress who poured coffee and packed leftovers in a small-town diner? The answers, like the boy's solemn gaze, held a story far deeper than anyone could have guessed. A story that would unravel in ways no one in the diner could have anticipated. Anna's eyes flicked to the parking lot more often that evening, scanning the deepening shadows for the boy who had vanished into the dusk like a wisp of smoke. Her chest tightened with a mix of hope and worry, her heart tethered to the faint possibility of his return. 3 weeks earlier, she'd first seen him, a ghostly figure emerging at twilight near the dumpsters behind the diner. His slight frame, taut with tension, reminded her of a deer poised to flee, his sharp eyes darting as if the world itself might pounce. Clad in an oversized military jacket that seemed to engulf him, he moved with a quiet wariness that stirred something deep in Anna, pity, curiosity, and a faint protective instinct she couldn't name. At first, she'd pretended not to notice him, sensing that a direct glance might send him scurrying into the night. Instead, she began leaving small gifts of food, foil-wrapped sandwiches, a handful of rolls, perhaps a slightly bruised apple, on the back step during her trash runs, as if they'd been forgotten. The food disappeared almost instantly, spirited away by unseen hands. Over time, the boy grew braver, inching closer to the diner. He abandoned the dumpster's shelter to sit on the old wooden bench at the lot's edge, his thin legs tucked beneath him, his gaze fixed on the back door with a patience that felt both heartbreaking and resolute. He never approached the diner, never spoke, never begged. His silence was a language of its own, and Anna learned to read it. She greeted him with an left food within his reach, and kept her distance, honoring the fragile trust growing between them. Their ritual was quiet, steady, and wordless, a small act of kindness woven into the rhythm of her days. That night, the diner felt heavier than usual. A customer's cruel words had lingered, their sharp edges cutting deeper than Anna wanted to admit. The man's mocking tone had unsettled her, leaving her nerves raw as she wiped down tables, refilled condiment bottles, and pocketed her modest tips. Her thoughts kept drifting to the boy. Where did he sleep when the night grew cold? Was there anyone searching for him, worrying about him? The questions gnawed at her, each one a reminder of how little she knew, and how little her small offerings seemed to matter. Should she do more? Could she? The uncertainty weighed on her, mingling with the ache of the evening's earlier sting. As she swept the floor, her eyes caught a glint of something out of place on the corner table, the one closest to where she left the food. A folded scrap of paper rested beneath a smooth riverstone, its weight holding the note like a secret. Anna's heart stuttered as she lifted the stone, her fingers trembling as she unfolded the paper. In shaky pencil strokes, it read, "Thank you." Below, in the same unsteady hand, was a line that stopped her breath. Dad said, "If someone is kind to you, tell his friend. I will tell." She stood rooted to the spot, the note quivering in her hand. The words, simple yet raw, carried a depth that tightened her throat and blurred her vision. For weeks, their connection had been silent, built on gestures rather than words. This note, with its clumsy sincerity, felt like a door creaking open, revealing a glimpse of the boy's guarded world. As she slipped the note into her apron, a memory sharpened in her mind. The boy's jacket, that faded military coat, too large for his frame, had a name tape stitched to it, half torn, with only "son" visible. The word struck her now, heavy with questions. Was it his father's? A brother's? Why did he wear it? And why was he alone? The note and the jacket wove together in her mind, spinning a story she could only guess at, each thread pulling at her heart. The next morning, the soft golden light of a Texas autumn bathed the town, casting a warm glow over the diner. Anna wasn't due to work until evening, but she stopped by anyway, drawn by the comfort of routine. The diner was alive with the clatter of plates and the hum of morning chatter. Frank worked the grill with quiet precision, flipping pancakes with a flick of his wrist, while Milliey, his 76-year-old wife, managed the register with a warmth that made every customer feel known. "Morning, honey," Milliey called, her voice cutting through the noise. "You're up earlier than usual." Anna slid onto her stool at the counter, cradling a mug of coffee. "Couldn't sleep much," she said, her smile faint. "Mine's been busy." Before Milliey could ask more, the phone rang, sharp and insistent. Milliey answered with her usual cheer. "Milley's Diner, where strangers become regulars and regulars become family." But as she listened, her face shifted. Her smile faded, replaced by a puzzled frown. "Yes, she works here," she said, glancing at Anna. "No, she's actually right here now. May I ask what this is concerning?" Anna watched, a knot of curiosity forming, as Milley's eyebrows shot up. "I see. Yes, I understand. We'll make sure she's available. Thank you." Milliey hung up, her eyes locking onto Anna's with a look of stunned confusion. Anna leaned forward, her coffee cooling in her hands. "What was that about?" she asked, her voice edged with apprehension. Millie hesitated, her fingers twisting the dish rag, as if searching for the right words to unravel the mystery that had just landed in their quiet morning. Anna's heart skipped a beat as she leaned closer to her coworker, her voice dropping to a hushed whisper despite the spark of excitement flickering in her chest. "That was someone from a federal office on the phone," she said, her brows knitting together in confusion. "They didn't say which one, just that representatives are coming here, specifically to talk to me." Her words hung in the air, tinged with a mix of curiosity and unease. The caller had been vague, offering no explanation beyond the cryptic assurance that it was important. Anna's mind churned, sifting through the mundane details of her life for any clue that might explain this. Why her? She was nobody special, just a waitress at Millie's diner, living a life she'd carefully crafted to be as uncomplicated as possible. Work, home, her cat Milo, and back again. That was her rhythm, her sanctuary. She steered clear of drama, avoided entanglements, and kept her world small and predictable. "Did I do something wrong?" she murmured, half to herself, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of her apron. Her thoughts darted to her tax filings. Had she missed something? Was her food handler's permit renewal somehow flagged? The possibilities swirled, each one more unsettling than the last. She glanced toward the kitchen where Frank emerged, wiping his calloused hands on his grease-stained apron. His pragmatic nature cut through her spiraling thoughts like a knife. "If you'd done something wrong, Anna, they wouldn't bother calling ahead," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "They'd just show up. Must be something else." His words were logical, but they did little to quiet the unease gnawing at her. All morning, Anna's mind was a whirlwind of what-ifs. Had someone reported her for slipping food to the boy who lingered outside the diner? She'd been discreet, or so she thought, tucking leftover sandwiches and fruit into a small package for him each evening. Was there some obscure regulation against sharing scraps with a hungry kid? Or was this about something entirely unrelated? Some bureaucratic mix-up with her name attached. By the time her evening shift rolled around, the initial jolt of alarm had dulled into a persistent hum of anxiety, a quiet tension that simmered beneath her usual calm demeanor. She moved through her tasks mechanically, finding solace in the familiar clink of plates, the rhythmic pour of coffee, the predictable chatter of regulars. The diner was her anchor, its routines a comforting constant in a world that suddenly felt unsteady. At 8:30 p.m., Anna paused by the window, her eyes scanning the empty bench across the street where the boy usually sat. For weeks, he'd been a fixture there, silent, watchful, his thin frame hunched against the evening chill. But tonight, the bench was bare, the street lamp casting a lonely glow over the empty space. Her stomach twisted with an unexpected pang of worry. She prepared the usual food package anyway, a sandwich, an apple, a cookie, placing it carefully in its usual spot by the back door. Standing in the cool night air, she lingered longer than usual, her breath visible in the crisp evening. Had the cruel taunts from some of the diner's rougher patrons the previous night driven him away? The memory of their mocking laughter stung her, and she wondered if the boy had felt it even more deeply. Or was it something worse, something tied to the mysterious call she'd received? The uncertainty clawed at her, a quiet dread she couldn't shake. Back inside, she caught Frank's gaze through the pass-through window, his eyes, usually gruff and no-nonsense, softened with concern. "No sign of him?" he asked, his voice low as if he too felt the weight of the boy's absence. Anna shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Maybe it's better if he doesn't come back," Frank said, his tone practical, but not unkind. "This handing out food, it's not exactly a solution for whatever mess he's in." Anna's chest tightened at his words, but she couldn't argue. Still, she countered softly, "Sometimes a sandwich isn't just a sandwich, Frank. Sometimes it's the only kindness someone gets all day." He nodded, his expression thoughtful, as if her words had struck a chord he hadn't expected. Anna turned back to her tables, her movements automatic, but her mind was elsewhere. The boy's absence and their cryptic phone call felt like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't yet see, their edges sharp with significance. Deep down, she knew they were connected, though how, she couldn't begin to guess. She was right, more right than she could have imagined. The next day at exactly 11:43 a.m., the quiet hum of Millie's diner was shattered by the arrival of 6 identical black SUVs, their government plates gleaming under a thin layer of dust from the rural Texas roads. They pulled up in perfect formation, a silent, imposing procession that seemed to suck the air out of the small town. Inside the diner, the clatter of cutlery and the murmur of conversation stopped dead. Forks hovered midair, coffee cups paused halfway to lips, and even the sizzle of the grill seemed to hush as every eye turned toward the windows. The vehicle's polished exteriors, coated with a fine film of red dust, hinted at a long journey, their presence as out of place in this sleepy town as a spaceship landing in the parking lot. From the lead SUV stepped a group of military personnel, their movements crisp and synchronized, each step radiating the precision of years spent under strict discipline. Among them stood a tall man whose presence commanded immediate attention. 4 stars gleamed on his shoulders, marking him as a general, his posture rigid yet effortless, as if authority were woven into his very being. Anna, who had picked up an extra morning shift at Milley's request, stood frozen by the coffee machine, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a pot of decaf. The general removed his cap and sunglasses with deliberate care as he entered, revealing a face weathered by time and responsibility, his gray hair cropped close in a traditional military style. The bell above the door chimed, its cheerful jingle absurdly ordinary against the surreal scene unfolding. The diner's patrons reacted instinctively to the general's presence. Grizzled farmers, men who hadn't stood at attention since their draft days decades ago, found themselves straightening, their shoulders squaring as if answering an unspoken command. The air felt charged, heavy with anticipation. The general's eyes swept the room, taking in every detail with a single measured glance before locking onto Anna. He crossed the diner with purposeful strides, his boots clicking softly against the linoleum floor. At the counter, he removed his gloves with slow, deliberate movements, each gesture imbued with a quiet authority that made Anna's pulse quicken. "Are you Anna Parker?" he asked, his voice low but resonant, carrying a weight that seemed to press against the walls of the diner. Her throat tightened, and for a moment, she could only nod, her mind racing with questions she didn't dare voice. Whatever this was, it was bigger than her simple life could have ever prepared her for. The diner was a sanctuary of stillness, its usual morning hum of clinking dishes and soft chatter silenced as every patron leaned in, drawn to the unfolding moment. Anna stood behind the counter, her hands trembling faintly, her breath caught somewhere between surprise and anticipation. The man before her, clad in a crisp military uniform, carried an air of authority tempered by something softer, something human. "I'm General Robert Harrison," he said, his voice steady yet heavy with unspoken emotion. "I'm Alex's legal guardian, the boy you've been feeding these past few weeks." The words landed like a quiet thunderclap, stirring a whirlwind of feelings in Anna's chest. Her heart quickened, a tangle of confusion and curiosity rising as she tried to grasp the significance of his presence. This man, with his stern yet kind eyes, was no ordinary visitor, and his connection to Alex, the quiet boy who had become a familiar shadow in her diner, was about to change everything she thought she understood. General Harrison's expression softened, as if he could see the questions flickering in Anna's eyes. "Alex lost his mother last month. Cancer," he said, his voice dipping into a well of sorrow that seemed to carve lines deeper into his weathered face. "His father, my son, was killed in action 2 years ago in a classified operation in Syria." The revelation hit Anna like a wave, her mind conjuring the image of Alex, small, solemn, his clothes always slightly too big, his eyes carrying a weight far beyond his years. She remembered how he'd linger near the diner's door, hesitant, as if testing whether this place would reject him like so much of the world already had. Her heart ached for him, for the unimaginable losses that had shaped his young life. The diner remained hushed, the silence almost sacred, as if every soul present understood they were witnessing something profound. General Harrison's voice grew quieter, more intimate, as he continued. "Alex has been struggling to find his footing in a world that keeps taking from him. He slips away from his caretaker sometimes, wandering off, maybe searching for a moment of solace." Anna's thoughts drifted to those quiet moments when Alex would sit at her counter, his small frame hunched over a plate of leftover sandwiches she'd set before him without fanfare. She hadn't pressed him to speak, hadn't asked for his story. It had felt right to let him exist in her dinar without the burden of questions. And now she wondered if that simple act of letting him be had meant more to him than she could have known. Reaching into his jacket with deliberate care, the general pulled out a slightly crumpled envelope. From it, he drew a child's drawing, its crayon lines bold yet unsteady, depicting a woman handing food to a small boy. Anna's breath caught as she recognized herself in the crude yet unmistakable figures, her heart swelling with a mix of warmth and sorrow. Below the image, in the same shaky handwriting that she'd seen on Alex's note, were the words, "Dad's friend who helps me." The phrase struck her like a chord, resonating with the memory of the note he'd left, anchored by a small river stone, a quiet gesture of trust she hadn't fully understood until now. "Alex hasn't spoken more than a dozen words since his mother's funeral," General Harrison said, his voice betraying a crack of emotion that revealed the depth of his own grief. "He's closed himself off from everyone, family, counselors, friends. But 3 days ago, he handed me this drawing and asked if I could find you." He turned the paper over, revealing a message that tightened Anna's chest with its raw honesty. "Dad, there's a lady like Mom. She doesn't ask me questions. She just gives me food and doesn't make me feel ashamed." The words were a window into Alex's heart, each one carrying the weight of his loss and the fragile hope he'd found in Anna's kindness. She blinked back tears, her throat tight, as she imagined him scribbling those words, clinging to a belief that she was somehow tied to his father, a guardian sent to watch over him. Clearing his throat, General Harrison steadied himself, his military composure returning, but not quite masking his vulnerability. "My grandson believes you're someone his dad sent to look after him. It's not rational, I know. Grief rarely is, especially for a child who's lost so much." His eyes met hers, filled with a quiet gratitude that made Anna's heart ache. "I don't know your son," she said, her voice soft but firm, grounded in the truth of her actions. "I just saw a hungry child and wanted to help." The simplicity of her words felt small compared to the moment, but they were honest. She hadn't known Alex's story, only that he needed kindness, and she'd given it without hesitation. The general nodded, a faint smile breaking through his stern exterior. "I know. But you're the first person he's reached out to since we lost his mother. The first person he's trusted enough to share even a fragment of himself with." Anna's heart swelled, a bittersweet mix of pride and sorrow washing over her. She thought of the quiet moments when Alex would sit at the counter, his small hands clutching a sandwich, his eyes occasionally meeting hers with a flicker of gratitude. Those moments had felt small to her, routine even, but now she saw them through his eyes. A lifeline in a world that had taken so much. The diner's silence held, the usual clatter of breakfast service suspended as everyone absorbed the weight of the moment. Frank, the cook, had stepped out from the kitchen, his arms crossed, his typically gruff demeanor softened by a rare glimpse of emotion. His eyes, usually fixed on the grill, now watched Anna with a quiet respect, as if he too recognized the power of her small acts of kindness. General Harrison's voice took on a new strength, though it was laced with a vulnerability that made him seem more human than his uniform suggested. "I've spent my career teaching soldiers about honor and duty. And he said, I've stood before thousands of troops speaking on the values that define us as a military. But today my grandson has taught me something I'll carry forever. That honor can live in the smallest acts, like a leftover sandwich or a gentle hand on a shoulder." His words struck Anna deeply, her mind replaying every interaction with Alex, wondering how something so simple could carry such profound meaning. Tears pricked her eyes again, and she fought to keep them at bay, overwhelmed by the realization that her quiet kindness had reached a boy drowning in grief. "Is he okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her concern for Alex overriding everything else. "Alex, I mean. I didn't see him yesterday." The general gestured toward the black SUVs parked outside, their sleek forms visible through the diner's windows. "He's out there. Would you be willing to speak with him properly this time?" Before Anna could answer, the bell above the diner's door chimed, a soft sound that seemed to echo in the stillness. Every head turned, and there, in the doorway, stood Alex. Clean and dressed in clothes that fit him properly, He looked different, yet achingly familiar. His expression was solemn, his posture hesitant, as if he wasn't sure he was allowed to step into this moment. General Harrison extended a hand toward him, his voice gentle and reassuring. "It's all right, son. This is the lady from your drawing." Alex moved slowly, each step measured, stopping a few feet from Anna. His eyes, sharp and burdened with a weight no child should carry, studied her intently, searching for something, perhaps the safety he'd felt in her presence before. Anna knelt to his level, her instincts guiding her to meet him where he was, to close the distance, without overwhelming him. "Hello, Alex," she said softly, her voice warm with the care she'd always shown him. "I'm Anna." He said nothing, but his small hand reached into his pocket and pulled out the same riverstone that had held down his note. He held it out to her, a silent offering, its smooth surface cool against her palm as she accepted it. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling within her. "I'll keep it safe." Alex gave a barely perceptible nod, a gesture so small yet so monumental that it felt like a breakthrough to everyone watching. The diner seemed to hold its breath, the moment fragile and sacred, a quiet testament to the power of connection in the face of loss. General Harrison spoke again, his tone lighter now, though still tinged with gratitude. "My team brought something for you, Miss Parker." He nodded to one of his aides, who stepped forward, ready to present whatever token of appreciation they'd prepared. But Anna's focus remained on Alex, on the stone in her hand, and on the quiet bond they'd forged in the unlikeliest of places. A small-town diner where a sandwich and a kind word had become a beacon of hope for a boy carrying the weight of the world. In the quiet hum of the diner, where the clink of coffee mugs and the murmur of small-town chatter formed a familiar rhythm, General Harrison stepped forward, his polished shoes gleaming under the fluorescent lights. In his hands he carried a leather portfolio, its rich, dark surface embossed with an air of official gravitas. The weight of the moment settled over the room as he presented it to Anna, his voice steady but warm. "This," he began, "is a letter of commendation from the Department of Defense. It recognizes your extraordinary compassion toward the family of a fallen hero." His words hung in the air, deliberate and resonant, as he explained that such an honor was rarely bestowed upon civilians. "In your case, Miss Parker, it is wholly deserved." The diner, usually a place of predictable routines, seemed to hold its breath. The same patrons who, just days ago, had watched Anna endure a cruel mockery, now gazed at her with a mixture of awe and reverence. Anna's hands trembled as she accepted the portfolio, her fingers brushing against the smooth leather. Her voice, soft and unsteady, broke the silence. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the floor as if she could deflect the weight of their admiration. General Harrison's expression softened, but his tone carried an unyielding certainty. "No, Miss Parker, not everyone would. That's exactly why we're here." Anna's heart raced, a whirlwind of disbelief and humility swirling within her. She had always seen herself as just a waitress, someone who poured coffee, remembered orders, and offered a kind word when needed. Yet here she was, standing before a four-star general, the center of a moment she could scarcely comprehend. Her thoughts drifted to Alex, the quiet boy whose grief had touched her so deeply, and to the simple act of kindness that had brought her to this point. She hadn't sought recognition. She hadn't even considered it possible. But the gravity of the general's words made her feel seen in a way she never had before. At that moment, as if scripted by fate, the diner's bell chimed, and the man who had mocked Anna 2 nights prior stepped inside. His bravado faltered as he took in the scene. Military personnel in crisp uniforms, a general radiating authority, and Anna, the woman he had belittled, now standing tall with a portfolio in her hands. His eyes darted nervously, his earlier arrogance replaced by a palpable discomfort. General Harrison's gaze flicked toward him, sharp and assessing, as if he could read the man's thoughts in an instant. "Is there a problem, sir?" the general asked, his voice calm but edged with steel. The man's face flushed, and he shook his head, already retreating toward the door. "No," he stammered, "no problem at all." Harrison nodded, his expression unchanging. "Good, because I believe this establishment operates on the principle that everyone matters, a philosophy I hold in the highest regard." The man slipped out, the bells jingle marking his exit with a finality that echoed through the room. The regulars exchanged glances, their knowing looks carrying a quiet satisfaction. They had seen Anna's strength, even when she hadn't seen it herself, and now the world seemed to be catching up. The general's attention returned to Anna, but before he could speak, one of his aides approached, whispering something in his ear. Harrison nodded, then addressed Anna again, his voice carrying a new layer of purpose. Miss Parker, we've taken the liberty of establishing a trust fund for Alex's education. Additionally, we'd like to make a contribution to this diner, specifically to provide meals for those who might otherwise go hungry. Frank, the diner's owner, stepped forward, his usual gruff demeanor softened by a rare swell of emotion. That's very generous, General, but Harrison raised a hand, his interruption smooth but firm. It's not charity, Mr. Thompson. It's a strategic investment in the resilience of this community. The military knows that strength begins when basic needs are met, and it starts with people like you and Miss Parker, who see those needs without being told. His eyes moved from Frank to Anna, lingering on her with a quiet respect that made her chest tighten. She felt a pang of gratitude, not just for the general's words, but for the way they seemed to affirm something she had always believed but never articulated, that small acts of care could ripple outward, touching lives in ways she couldn't predict. Another aide approached, this time carrying a polished wooden box. The general opened it with care, revealing a medallion resting on a bed of blue ribbon. This is the Civilian Service Medal from the Department of Defense, he explained, his voice steady but imbued with a personal warmth. It honors civilians whose actions reflect the core values our military strives to uphold: compassion, selflessness, and moral courage. Anna stared at the medal, her breath catching, as she tried to reconcile the weight of the moment with the simplicity of her actions. She had only done what felt right, offering a meal, a kind word, a moment of comfort to a grieving boy. How could something so instinctive lead to this? The diner fell silent again, the kind of silence that felt sacred, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing something rare. General Harrison's voice took on a more intimate tone, as though he were speaking not just to Anna, but to a memory he held close. My son, Alex's father, believed that true warriors weren't defined by their actions in battle, but by how they treated the vulnerable in times of peace. He would have seen your kindness for what it was, Miss Parker, the highest form of service. His words struck Anna deeply, stirring a mix of pride and sorrow. She thought of Alex's father, a man she had never met but whose legacy seemed to live in the boy's quiet strength. She wondered what he would have thought of her, and the thought brought a lump to her throat. With deliberate care, the general placed the medallion in Anna's palm, closing her fingers gently around it. Not all heroes wear uniforms, Abbas, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the diner. Some wear aprons. The words landed like a quiet thunderclap, and Anna felt tears prick at her eyes. She glanced to the side and saw Milliey, the older waitress who had worked alongside her for years, dabbing at her cheeks with a napkin, her face a mix of pride and tenderness. Frank stood taller than Anna had ever seen him, his stoic facade giving way to a quiet reverence. For Frank, the diner had always been more than a business. It was a place where people came together, where stories unfolded, and now it was a place where one of his own was being honored. Then, without warning, Alex moved toward Anna. The boy, who had been silent throughout the exchange, wrapped his thin arms around her waist, his small frame trembling with emotion. It was the kind of embrace that spoke of trust, of a child seeking solace from the one person who had offered it freely. Anna froze for a moment, caught off guard by the depth of his need, but then she softened, returning the hug with a gentle hand resting on his head. Her heart swelled with a fierce protectiveness, mingled with a quiet ache for the pain he carried. In that moment, she realized that her kindness had meant more to him than she could have imagined, and the thought both humbled and strengthened her. No one in the diner spoke. The silence was profound, a shared acknowledgement that words weren't needed. Anna felt it deeply, the unspoken connection that had formed between her and Alex, between her and the community that had watched her grow. She understood, in a way she never had before, that the most meaningful acts of kindness often went unnoticed, unfolding in quiet moments without fanfare. Yet here, in the glow of this unexpected recognition, she saw how those acts could shine, binding people together in ways that endured. From that moment on, Milliey's Diner, a modest fixture in the community for decades, carried a different kind of warmth. The unassuming eatery, once known only for its reliable coffee and its hearty plates, now it held a quiet legacy etched into its menu. Alex's sandwich, a simple creation, turkey and cheese layered on whole wheat, adorned with an extra helping of pickles, crafted with careful care just as Anna had made it for the young boy. The sandwich wasn't just food, it was a symbol, a reminder of a small act that had rippled far beyond the diner's worn-out countertops. General Harrison, a man whose presence commanded respect, shunned the spotlights despite the clamor of reporters eager for his story. When a determined local journalist cornered him off after a follow-up visit to the diner, he offered only a single measured sentence, his voice steady but heavy with meaning. "I came to thank a soldier who doesn't wear in a uniform." Those words, simple yet profound, spread like wildfire through the military communities. They struck a chord with the service members who knew that valor and sacrifice weren't limited to the battlefield. For them, the general's words were a quiet acknowledgement of the unseen heroes who carried their own burdens with grace and dignity. Alex, the boy at the heart of this story, found a new home with his uncle, his father's brother, a recently retired Army veteran. The move offered him stability, a tether to the military legacy his fathers had left behind. The uncle's house was just close enough to the Millies that Alex could make the trip on weekends, settling into his familiar routine. No longer did he sit alone on the weathered bench outside, staring at the world through a veil of grief. Instead, he claimed a small table by the window, marked with a subtle placard bearing his name, a quiet gesture from the diner's staff that felt like a warm embrace. Slowly, the sharp edges of his pain began to soften. Healing came through in tentative steps, a whispered thank you when Anna refilled his chocolate milk, a shy question about Milo, the diner's resident cat, who lounged lazily in the sunlit corners. By the time Christmas rolled around, Alex's words carried a little more light. During the quiet moments of Anna's shifts, he began to share fragments of his father's memories. "He could eat 3 of my sandwiches," he said one chilly evening, his voice glinting with pride and longing. "But he always left the crusts behind." The words, though small, were a victory, a sign that the boy was finding his way back to himself. Anna, the heart of the Millies, remained steadfast in her simplicity. Offers poured in, interviews, book deals, even a prestigious role in the general's private household. But she turned them all down without any hesitation. Her life was anchored in the diner, in the rhythm of pouring coffee and wiping down tables, now enriched by her bond with Alex and the extended military family who had welcomed her as one of their own. "I never wanted fame," she told Frank, the diner's owner, when he pressed her about declining a particularly generous offer. Her voice was soft but firm, her eyes steady. "I just wanted to help a hungry kid." Frank nodded, his weathered face softening with understanding. He knew Anna's heart better than most. Yet Frank had made one change to the diner, a quiet tribute to the woman who had transformed it. Alongside the wall of military photographs, a common sight in establishments near the bases, he hung a new frame. Inside was Anna's letter of commendation, paired with a simple handwritten quote. "People often recognize honor in uniforms. Sometimes it wears a faded apron and offers a meal no one sees." The words captured Anna's essence, her quiet strength, and the way she moved through the world with a grace that needed no applause. 6 months after General Harrison's visit, something remarkable unfolded. The trust fund he had established for Alex began receiving anonymous donations from military personnel across the globe. What began as a gesture to support one grieved boy grew into something far greater, a foundation dedicated to helping the children of fallen service members. They called it the Bench Initiative, a nod to the bench where Alex once waited and a metaphor for offering rest to those carrying heavy loads. Anna was invited to serve on its advisory board, a role she accepted with reluctance, feeling unqualified among the military officers, child psychologists, and social workers who filled the conference room at the local library for the Foundation's first meeting. "I don't have any special training," she admitted, her hands fidgeting with a pen as she glanced around the table. "I just saw a child who needed help and didn't make a fuss about giving it." A silver-haired professor who had flown in from Washington leaned forward, his eyes kind but resolute. "That's exactly why you're here," he said. You saw need without demanding forms or protocols. You gave dignity alongside a meal, things our programs often miss. On the first anniversary of their meeting, Anna received a package from Alex, who was now thriving in ways that once seemed impossible. Inside was a carefully crafted miniature of Milliey's diner, every detail lovingly recreated. The tiny windows, the faded awning, even the bench where he'd once waited sat. Tucked beside it was a note in Alex's careful handwriting. You made me feel at home when I was lost. This is for you. Anna traced the words with trembling fingers, her eyes misty with a quiet joy that needed no words. At Milliey's diner, tucked at the edge of a worn parking lot, a small bench stood as a quiet testament to a child's gratitude and a woman's compassion. The bench, crafted in a drawing by young Alex, was rendered with astonishing detail for someone so young, each slat of wood carefully shaded, the grain almost tangible, the surrounding gravel sketched with meticulous care. It was the kind of work that spoke of hours spent hunched over a piece of paper, pouring heart and soul into every line. Accompanying the drawing was a note, its words simple yet heavy with meaning. This is where I found my voice again. Thank you for waiting until I was ready to use it. For Alex, that bench wasn't just a place to sit. It was a sanctuary, a moment of safety where he could finally breathe, where the weight of his silence lifted under the gentle patience of someone who saw him not as a problem, but as a person. The man who had once mocked Anna, Tarni saw him, uswaited him. And the diner's steadfast waitress carried his own burden of regret. His sharp words, thrown carelessly in a moment of frustration, had lingered in his mind, gnawing at him until he could no longer ignore the shame. He returned to Milliey's only once, his steps hesitant, his face etched with the kind of vulnerability that comes from confronting one's own failings. Yes. In his hand was a handwritten apology, the ink smudged in places as if he'd labored over each word, rewriting it until it felt honest. Alongside it, he offered something more tangible. Payment for a month's worth of sandwiches, to be given free to any child who came to the diner hungry. It was his way of making amends, of reaching back to a moment he couldn't undo. Anna received both with the quiet grace that defined her. She didn't linger on the hurt his words had caused, nor did she seek to hold his mistake over him. We all have bad days, she said softly, her voice steady but warm, like a hearth fire on a cold night. What matters is what we learn from them. Her words weren't just forgiveness. They were an invitation to be better, a gentle nudge toward redemption that left the man standing a little taller, though his eyes glistened with unspoken gratitude. The story of Alex's bench didn't stay confined to the diner's parking lot. Word spread, carried by whispers and shared glances, until it reached military communities far beyond the small town. In bases and towns across the country, similar acts of kindness began to take root. Small benches, free meals, quiet gestures that asked nothing in return. These weren't grand, organized efforts. They were organic, born from the story of a waitress who saw a hungry boy and chose to act, and a child who found his voice through her patience. Each new initiative was a ripple, spreading outward from that single act of compassion, touching lives in ways Anna could never have predicted. She didn't seek credit for it, didn't see herself as the spark that started it all. To her, it was just what you did when someone needed help. You offered it, no questions asked. Alex's drawing, now framed simply and hung behind the diner's counter, became a quiet centerpiece of Milliey's. Its presence drew the eyes of new customers who'd pause mid-bite to ask about the small bench depicted in pencil and crayon. Anna never made the story about herself. Instead, she'd lean against the counter, coffee pot in hand, and share the heart of it. Sometimes people just need kindness without questions. Her voice would soften as she refilled mugs, her eyes crinkling with a warmth that made strangers feel like regulars. Food without judgment, help without having to explain why they need it. To Anna, the drawing wasn't just a child's gift. It was a reminder of what mattered most. Seeing people, really seeing them, in their moments of need. On quiet evenings, when the dinner rush faded and the diner settled into a hum of familiar voices, Anna would steal glances at the empty bench outside. It stood under the glow of a street lamp, waiting just as she did. She kept a sandwich ready behind the counter, wrapped and waiting for another silent figure who might emerge from the shadows. A child, a stranger, anyone carrying a weight they couldn't yet voice. Anna had learned something profound in her journey from an unnoticed waitress to an unwitting beacon of hope. Kindness doesn't just stop at the moment it's given. It creates ripples, traveling far beyond the giver's sight, touching lives in places they may never know. Sometimes those ripples return as waves, crashing back with a force that changes everything they touch. For Anna, the wave was Alex's drawing, the man's apology, the benches sprouting up across the country, proof that a single act offered without expectation could transform the world in ways even she couldn't fully grasp.